Beardsley from the U.S. Green Building Council. We're pleased to be here today, day 6 at COP28 in Dubai. Today is Multinational and Built Environment Day. So a lot going on in the building space. Yesterday, we launched a new report in partnership with Arup. We'll be getting into that in more detail today with some leaders. Green Building Council. We're pleased to be here today, day 6 at COP28 in Dubai. Today is multinational. Okay. All right. Excellent. So we have a great lineup today. Starting us off will be Peter Templeton, President and CEO of the U.S. Green Building Council, and then Rob Kay from Arup, America's lead for climate and sustainability, will be leading a panel discussion. We have Guy Granger from JLL, Sarah Neff from Lend-Lease Americas, and Corey from Carrier. So, without further ado, Peter.
Thank you, Liz, and good morning and welcome to everyone. I appreciate you all joining us in person here and virtually, and hope you're having a great and productive COP. USGBC has been participating in COP for the past 15 years, and we are encouraged by the growing attention being paid to the building sector here in Dubai. We want to thank the Climate Registry and Climate Action Reserve for hosting today's event and giving us the opportunity to further highlight progress and priorities for this critical work. I'd like to just make a few short remarks to kick off today's discussion. This week, as Liz mentioned, USGBC, in partnership with Arup, released a new report on the state of the U.S. commercial building decarbonization, providing a deeply researched analysis of trends, drivers, and opportunities across the sector. I'm grateful to Rob Kay and his team at Arup for contributing their expertise, having led the design and engineering of so many high-performance buildings in the United States and around the world. Similar to the UN's global stocktake and the 5th National Climate Assessment released by the Biden-Harris administration just ahead of COP, the report helps our industry understand where we are at this critical moment in time. It's also a call to action for leaders in our industry to greatly accelerate our efforts to decarbonize, and I'm thrilled that we are joined today by so many of those leaders to help inspire others to follow. The report describes genuine progress bringing absolute emissions in the commercial building sector in line with 1990 levels, despite a large increase in total floor area over the same time period. More than half of America's largest commercial real estate investment trusts have energy reduction goals, and 1 in 4 has adopted science-based decarbonization targets representing more than 2 billion square feet of collective commercial floor area. State and local governments are continuing to adopt advanced energy codes for new construction, and the industry is making significant strides on decarbonizing existing buildings. And yesterday, we were fortunate to be joined with the report launch by a number of those leaders for local level, as well as other global industry players to reflect on the progress that we're making collectively and some of the priorities that we need to address moving forward. Today, nearly 15 cities and states now have performance standards designed to reduce operational energy and carbon across entire building life cycles, and the Federal Inflation Reduction Act incentives have the potential to significantly increase the rate of energy retrofits sector-wide. But these positive trends remain unevenly distributed across the sector and the nation, and do not put commercial buildings on a path to zero emissions by 2050. But I believe that goal is within our reach. Having worked in the industry for decades, it's easy to recall a time within the recent past when decarbonization wasn't part of the commercial real estate consciousness, when corporations and governments weren't leading the sustainability and ESG movements, and when industry lacked fundamental tools to measure and monitor emissions, to create and prioritize actions, and to set and achieve targets. I believe that goal is within our reach. In a relatively short period of time, we have proven that climate and sustainability transformation is possible with the commercial building sectors. We've readied the market for the innovation in policy and technology and practice and process that's necessary to achieve this decarbonization at scale. As our research shows, we have made tremendous progress, and we have the tools and technologies today to embark on another transformation to eliminate emissions from the buildings within our lifetime if we're truly committed to do so. Our goal is to spur the conversations and increase collaboration and to inspire more of the sector to get on track. We hope organizations, governments, and advocates will dig into the issues the report presents and apply these insights to their climate actions. We invite you to engage with us to create healthy, resilient, low-carbon buildings and communities that foster equity and biodiversity with greater speed and scale. I'm looking forward to the panel today and want to thank Rob Kay for facilitating this discussion, as well as our panelists, Corey Ricaldi from Carrier, Guy Granger from JLL, and Sarah Neff with Lend-Lease. These longtime USGBC member organizations are climate leaders who have not only helped us achieve the progress highlighted in the report, but have also set an example for others working across the industry to follow. Thank you.
Right. Thanks very much, Peter, and thanks, Liz. I have to say, I crashed really hard last night. The event, the day yesterday, was such an energetic, empowering day, actually, and just reflecting on the fact of the report really caused ripples globally, as well as then, if you like, providing the wings or putting air under the wings of local leaders. I think that we heard from in the panel launch yesterday, they're doing incredible work on the ground and actually giving voice and recognizing the work that is being done across the US. And then waking up this morning at 4 a.m. Thinking, all right, I need some caffeine to then help us into power through the next phase of the discussion, which is literally, okay, what are we going to do now? What are we going to do now that might be different from the leadership that you're already showing? And then actually having some reflections really on in the context of the report, but more broadly the work that you're all doing personally and the organizations that you are involved in and involved in the leadership of. So it's in that context of just having a really a deep conversation, time permitting, of course, as much as we can over the next hour or so. So perhaps starting with you, Corey, just who you are, how you fit in, and what you're excited about.
Thank you. So Corey Ricaldi, my role at Carriers, I'm the sustainability lead, and I will provide the perspective on the panel in terms of the technology. So we are an HVAC and transport refrigeration manufacturer, and what are the perspective in terms of the technology, in terms of the solutions, and what we're hearing from customers. I'm very excited to have the conversation today, and it's one. It's interesting to see how over time things are becoming more real. There's more of a dialogue with customers on the topic.
Thank you.
And I'm Sarah Neff. I'm head of sustainability for Lend-Lease in the Americas. And while I totally love talking energy efficiency, I will talk a retrofit all day long. I think my best contribution here is on scaling embodied carbon solutions, which are very scalable throughout many places in the world, but as the report says, are unevenly distributed. But these are solutions that the technology exists without the need for more testing. I think the report is totally accurate on this subject. And it's a lot of procedures to get us there. It's a lot of thinking smarter about how we procure those materials, and we can lop off, 10, 20, 30% of our embodied carbon. So I'm very excited about that.
Thanks, Rob. Guy Granger, I head up our sustainability services, but also oversee our sustainability commitments to the markets. We're a US-listed company, so I see it from both sides. And I hope to bring a bit of market perspective. The industry is a little bit caught in the headlights at the moment by cost of finance, by other risks that are out there. But I'm kind of surprised because our industry is usually very sharp at spotting gaps between supply and demand. And there is a huge gap between the demand for low carbon buildings and the actual provision of low carbon buildings, particularly in the US and parts of the US. But I think it's potentially going to go the quickest out of all the markets to respond.
Okay, fantastic. Look, I'm going to start actually by who you're talking to in your respective organizations, with your clients, in your industry groups. So who have you been talking to historically, and how has that changed over time? Corey?
So the dialogue is different now because, as the report points out, I think it was around 68% or so of the Fortune 500 companies had set greenhouse gas emission targets. A lot of those are aligned to SBTi, right? So the dialogue is different because now there are these very ambitious targets. The math is dictated on how it needs to be. There's no creative accounting. And so the conversations with industry is elevated to the C-suite level in terms of decisions in the building. So you would have a conversation with the chief sustainability officer. You would have a conversation perhaps with the head of finance. These are different elevated conversations because then you can break through that first cost barrier. You talked about financing and that barrier because higher technology, higher energy efficient technologies are more expensive. However, if you look at the total cost of ownership, it'll drive that down. So when you look at a building, just to provide a bit of context, about 40% of a building's energy use is associated with our products. And so with HVAC. And so that's why we're an important part of the conversation with building owners and developers.
Yeah, I'm just going to pick at that a little bit because one of the questions that's always difficult working with clients as a consultant is to actually ask the why question rather than the what. And so it feels like you actually have permission to ask the why question.
Yeah. So I won't name names, but like when
Name the names. Do it. Totally do it.
but when we've had a few dialogues with household name brands, we did our research. We looked at their reporting. We understood their pain points, and we were able to go and have a very precise and productive conversation about. I know that you have a pain point here in terms of refrigerant leakage, or you need to think about you have this issue with this type of building because we went through and looked at how they're approaching their climate ambition, and that conversation was very productive, and we were able to continue that conversation with similar types of customers.
Right, that's really interesting. I'm gonna pick that up, but just a shout out to all the disclosure folks. Reporting and disclosure is good. Right, bottom line.
You understand it. If you understand how to use it.
Well, if you understand it, yeah. So yeah, good point. So 2 points: one, understanding, and then actually having the permission structure, if you like, to ask, because I'm sure historically you were dealing with building managers, perhaps at a different scale, different level.
And that would have been not of a productive conversation because they're not held accountable to those targets. They're very far down the chain. So again, having that conversation at the right level of the C-suite and then understanding the customer is where the conversation starts.
Oh, that's fascinating, Sarah.
So yeah, it's a very different it's a very different conversation. So Lend-Lease, I should say, has set the goal of being absolute zero carbon by 2040, including Scope 3, which is insane, right? Like nobody knows what a zero carbon flight is either, but like whatever, we're doing it. And so what that means is that it's now in the covenants with our JV partners when we have a new development fund that says, okay, all these assets have to be net neutrally operating from day one, including construction and tenant emissions, construction operational. And so that just changes the conversation in the contracting, right? So all of a sudden you're having to write performance-based contracting because this has to be delivered or else we're not meeting our JV partnership requirements. The other thing that this has totally changed is that we now have to talk to our competitors all the time because we have to send collective demand signals. So Lend-Lease published earlier this year our Scope 3 protocol, which is to say, hey, here's what's in and out of Scope 3. Like, here's what we are getting to zero. Now we're in the process of trying to teach all of our competitors how to do the same thing, and then also have them join with us to say, hey, if you can produce low carbon concrete, we will buy it. Hey, Department of Energy, if you help fund the scaling of low carbon concrete, there is demand over here. So it is a completely different set of invitees to the party than it was 5 years ago, where you spent a lot of time at conferences sort of just presenting a case study. Like, that does not cut it anymore. It's collaborating up and down many aspects of the supply chain, down to the, not just your concrete sub, but to the batch supplier and to the cement supplier. I mean, you're going so far up and down the supply chain, so lateral within your own industry and up to the money as well. So it's a really different situation these days.
Right. But just before I go to you guys, where would we find the Scope 3 report?
Just Google Lend-Lease Scope 3 protocol. It'll come right up, publicly available. So I'm sure we can figure out a way to tag it on the virtual presentation. But yes, please download, please do it. It's a user-friendly guide. And the only thing I will say about it, just as a warning, is that we acknowledge that there are certain emissions that are like in a gray area. Like, nobody likes gray areas within sustainability. We want things to be in or out. We want the HVAC emissions in or the HVAC emissions definitely not in. And we acknowledge that there are certain emissions that we influence without having them be directly related to our business. So a good example is like employee flights. Yep, those are in the scope 3. I can tell you when to fly and not to fly. Employee automobile commuting, like I can influence that through like where, an office is. Do you have commuter benefits? Do you have EV charging stations? But I cannot tell you where to live or what car to drive. And so that's not in what has to get to absolute zero for us. So being able to sort of get comfortable with the fact that certain things are influenced but not in there is, I think, one of the things that's going to be hardest for real estate, especially as the data, even for what we say is black and white, is so squishy. So it's a new world.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sarah. Back to questions. Who are you asking questions of, and has that changed?
Well, we are also a consultant, and we provide services probably about 50-50 between corporate occupiers and real estate investors and developers, and a bit to the public sector as well. So, and what's really interesting is that when you have conversations with corporate occupiers, they talk about buildings like, actually, we know what we've got to do with buildings. Buildings are almost like the easy bit of our carbon footprint because they're real assets, they're real things. Our supply chain's the really hard bit, right? And that's probably 90% of our carbon footprint. But at least with buildings, we know we've got to get clean energy to them. We know they've got to be really efficient, and that we know that actually the resources that we use in them are pretty scarce resources or high carbon resources, so we've got to minimize those. And then when you speak to the investment community, it's a very different conversation. And I think it's a very different conversation because we know what we've got to do, we just haven't worked out how we're going to pay for it, and actually who's going to pay for it. And this is where that whole conversation, and I think the actual real estate investment model needs to adapt quickly from one that is just a linear financial model, secure a rent for as long as possible and capitalize it, to one of partnership. Exactly what you talked about, actually. The stronger the partnership, the more sticky actually the income over a longer period of time, the more likelihood tenants are going to renew leases, however long they are. They don't need to be that long, but all of our corporate tenants, corporate occupiers are saying, find me the partners to work with so that we can not only design low carbon buildings, but probably more importantly, use them in a way which is really efficient, because a lot of our certifications and models at the moment are all about like when you hand the building over to the tenant. And actually we need a lot more user manuals and user coordination and partnership, like you say, between the owner and the occupier, asking the right questions, providing the right data, so that actually the owner is providing a really valuable service to the occupier on how they can use the building far more efficiently, so that over time we can drive that demand for energy down, as well as get the right supplies in there. So this is really turning into a partnership model, and I see entrepreneurial real estate developers and investors, and I would put Lendlease definitely into that bracket, as identifying this and going after it, not just as a sort of competitive advantage, but actually as the future model, and saying, like, this is how we are going to kind of drive our business going forward. And that is a change in the way of working. That is change management. That is transformation. That's why this is hard to do, right? It's not moving at a couple of degrees. It's actually sort of almost turning the real estate investment model on its head and saying the customers are the capital, but actually the real customers are the users of the building. So let's really lean into that relationship.
Super interesting. I actually want to just keep going on that about the business case for decarbonising, and keep on we were talking about this yesterday, the leading edge versus the trailing edge in this transition, and clearly we're talking about the leading edge here. So in terms of that customer base, let's just pick at that a little bit more. Those conversations that we've been talking about around the maturity of the conversations that you've been having, Corey, you talked about that, and you did too, Sarah, that continuing that around the business case and making the case for deeply decarbonised buildings, both on operational and embedded carbon, through changing business models. So I don't quite know what the question is.
I have a thought on that.
We've all got an opinion. You haven't asked a question, and we've all got an opinion.
I love it.
Go ahead, you go ahead.
Corey, go ahead.
So I think what's interesting for us is that we're transforming our business. Okay, so we're in the process of having a new acquisition in terms of a large heat pump company, Viessmann in Europe, and we're transforming how we talk about ourselves into an energy and climate energy solutions provider. Right, we're looking at ourselves very differently than a traditional HVAC manufacturer, which we were historically, but now getting into energy management and climate solutions because of the things we're talking about just now, in the sense that we understand that to drive decarbonization, it's not enough just to provide our HVAC unit. We need to provide data. We need to enable sensors, data with that equipment so that the building owner and operator understands how the building is being run, where the pain points are, then has that data so they can have action in terms of operating that building. And then over time, can that building then become an energy provider, right? Can it be optimized energy such that during peak demand, we can then give energy back to the grid or such. And so the building itself, we're in a time now where we are getting to a place where we have opportunity in terms of digital technologies, energy management, all of that coming into one application that companies like Carrier can provide. And that's going to allow deeper decarbonization. And that's particularly important when you think about all of the electrification that's happening in the grid. That is more than what utilities can handle today. So we need to help that transition in a way that enables resiliency.
That's great. Thank you.
And I would just say, from an existing building retrofit standpoint, I would love for us to start thinking of the customer as the building engineer. So many times an asset manager, a building owner is like, this is great. They hear about some fantastic technology. They buy it. All of that stuff is just there to like get the building engineer to do their jobs differently. But if the building engineer hasn't bought in, it is completely, you'll get a tenth, if any. I mean, I have a building right now where the building engineer inherited some software. He hates it. He doesn't log in. I get a report every week showing 0 savings. And it's like, great, like we're spending money on this and we're not getting anything out of it. We forget that buildings are run by people. And nobody gets into building engineering for the glory, right? Like these are stable jobs, they're great jobs, they're harder and harder jobs as fewer and fewer people are going into this trade and they're being asked to manage more real estate. It's an aging population. This is where the action happens in terms of existing building, and we tend to just pretend they don't exist as if a building buys something. We are trying to influence a person's behavior. And if we don't change our thinking on customer and have them pull in and teach them the business case and get them excited and recognize, I mean, the greatest like energy efficiency project I ever did was I made like baseball cards for all of our building engineers across our portfolio that had like their little stats and like how, like how much they'd reduced in their certifications. It was free. You can find it online. And like that portfolio reduced its energy consumption more than it ever had before. And I was getting things like, you understand me more than my wife does. And like, you are, like this is, I'm just so happy to be recognized. And I know I'm working for a great company. And we doubled over our energy target. I mean, we have to think of the building engineer as the customer, because otherwise, everybody's disappointed. When you get a great technology, you get a fantastic new heat pump or Carrier product, and then it's not used properly.
Thank you, Sarah, because I think about 40,000 of those building engineers work at our company on site in buildings. And, I think giving these people an incentive, a reason, a purpose, whereas actually, if I'm honest, they just feel completely under pressure the whole time because we're in a cost system and a procurement system which kind of
tenant comfort, right?
Yeah, which pushes them to the lowest common denominator. And I think we saw it during the pandemic. These building engineers became the front line, the essential part of our business. And I think we need to bring them on the journey, just like you bring all the suppliers on the journey. But I love the idea of gamifying this. I mean, everybody wants a purposeful job. And actually, I think those building engineers' job is more purposeful than it's ever been before. This isn't just about cost efficiency. This is about driving down emissions. I just wanted to pick up one thing that you said, Rob. which was about leading indicators. And we are all here at COP because of leading indicators. And there's a lot of business leaders here and government with those leading indicators. However, a lot of our industry, and I'd sort of put this at the sort of real estate investment and development industry, has got a mindset of lagging indicators, particularly how we assess the value of real estate. It's always on historic data, right? And we are reaching this point, actually, where the system is being changed through this disruptive force of climate change. So it's a new data point. And if we continue to assess decisions on historic data, that's not going to tell us what the value of tomorrow will be. I think that a lot of business cases are not getting through investment committees at the moment because we're underestimating the value of creating low carbon buildings when there is a huge undersupply of them. And you cannot assess that value on historic data. We also have a lot of valuers in our business, and a lot of the industry is sort of blaming the valuers. We are in a system, right? We're in a system that looks at historic data, looks at lagging indicators. And the way to turn this into an opportunity is to look at leading indicators and make decisions on leading indicators.
This is great. I just want to make a couple of reflections, actually. There seems to be what you're reflecting on perhaps differently. Perhaps I'm processing this in my own way, thinking also from the resilience events that I've been participating in over the last few days as well, that this sense of decarbonising of assets, but the decarbonising for. Who are you decarbonising for? And you, in your own ways, you talked about different stakeholder groups, investor groups, tenant groups, your staff, your building manager groups, and actually, and again, in your point, thinking about turning buildings into resilience assets, decarbonisation assets, actually contributing to grid security, grid resilience, and so on. There's been some fantastic conversations in this room, actually, on that very subject over the last few days. There was one here yesterday that I participated in. And that just seems to be a transition. I think that there's something here, I think, to build that forward momentum and actually pick that up. Perhaps also reflecting on my career joining Arup. I remember last year doing an summer interns presentation. It was 100 interns in the Americas, and actually polling them, why did you decide to join us? Was sustainability an important part of that? And it was like 99% or some crazy number. But this sense of actually thinking about all those different stakeholder groups and moving from there. Talking of leading edge and trailing edge, I just want to pivot the conversation actually to thinking about one of the things that was very clear, and you touched on this earlier in the discussion from the report that was launched yesterday, was this incredible disparity across the US in terms of building performance standards and local policies and regulations and how different they all are. I just want to have a discussion around how your organizations and perhaps more broadly the industry sectors that you work in are thinking about moving the whole sector forward, not just on the leading edge, but all of those parts of the spectrum. So I'll just throw that open. Who'd like to address that first?
So for us, that we look at it in different approaches. So we're certainly part of building code standards and such like ASHRAE and all of that. Like that's how we engage there, and those then trickle down. What we were excited about, and I'm sure we'll get into, is the IRA in the U.S. and the market signal that is sending and creating for our customers and even for ourselves. Where I think the opportunity is with government, government has a role to play to support R&D investments. That is something that for high technologies, high investment, there is opportunity, and there have been some announcements here at COP around that where DOE is partnering. So that's exciting. That's an opportunity. Another opportunity is providing those tax incentives and rebates to customers to help get at that high first cost, because the customers are not able to think. It's hard when you're an individual homeowner and you're thinking about high technology and you're thinking about what your budget is, and you need that incentive to get you over that hump to then buy that more energy efficient unit. The other opportunity is also just sending again that signal to the marketplace that the higher efficiency, that is where we need to be, and that's what the IRA is doing, and we're particularly excited about that, particularly the tax credit for heat pumps.
Yeah, for us, we're as the report very clearly says, like we're out of the stage of pilots. Pilots are done. We don't have time. We have all the technology we need. It's fine. So now it's about learning. So where a building code is higher or where something is available, and then scaling it as fast as possible where you can. So a good example is all electric construction equipment. Okay, so we can get that in California. The temp power doesn't show up quite fast enough. So like for reals, I have an electric crane running off a diesel generator with renewable diesel, but the whole thing breaks my heart. We can only get renewable diesel in California too. But okay, fine. Why can't I have that electric crane in New York? Well, the answer is I can't use a generator because it's too loud. I can't get temp power fast enough, so then it's just a diesel crane. Okay, fine. So then that means we then have to start talking to the utility about how do we get temp power faster. And so it's like once you learn that a technology exists, it becomes very like, well, why you get very spoiled. You're like, well, why can't I have this everywhere? Like it works fine. And so then it's a matter of like trying to change the situation elsewhere. So, and sometimes you can and sometimes you can't. So like I have a project in New York where we were able to, at no cost, replace 40% of the Portland cement in the foundation with ground glass pozzolan, which is like a recycled glass compound. Can't get it elsewhere. Can't get it in Chicago. Can't get it in California. Okay, so now let's talk about the people who might be starting up in there and like sending, getting them the letters that they need to say, okay, if you build it, we will buy it. So it's all about like learning something where the codes and the market and the whatever regulations allow for it, and then trying to make it more universal. So instead of just being like, I guess that's just a Chicago thing, trying to make everything, scaled everywhere.
I think that's exactly the right approach. You've got to go as fast as possible in the territories that allow you to go as fast as possible and try and take it elsewhere. I mean, it's interesting. I've got a global role, so I see what happens in sort of nations and cities all around the world. I actually like what's happening in the US at the moment with all these new building codes coming through. What the US has got, which Europe doesn't have, and I know people think Europe is advanced, it's definitely advanced in reporting disclosure, much more so than anywhere else, and that has changed behavior. It's not just about culture. But the US is really good on data, and actually, particularly around buildings, and Europe's awful on that. It's really hard to get aggregated data on buildings. And as a result, these building codes that are coming through, the cities that are driving the change, whether it's in California, New York, Boston, other places, are actually, they will end up leading, right? Because they'll get there quicker. And I think a lot of cities are looking on with interest. The C40 who are here, I think, love copycat legislation, particularly in cities. So I'm really interested in what's happening at a city level more than anything else. And what's interesting comparing Europe to the US is going really fast on building codes, on availability of data, on emissions from buildings. Europe and European cities are taking a more aggressive approach on embodied carbon, on nature-based solutions as well. So I think everyone's going to be looking at each other, trying to go as fast as possible to get that scale. And I think navigating this will present a really attractive commercial proposition, because at the end of it all, you are trying to create the most the least impactful and energy efficient buildings possible. And, occupiers and users will really warm to that. And they will really be attracted to that. I cannot sort of stress enough, and I've noticed it here more than any other COP, this is turning into a demand-led proposition, right? It definitely is. Certainly in the commercial space. We'll have to see on multifamily because consumers are slightly different. But hopefully when the next generations come through, it'll be the same. It's a demand-led change now. And that should be a very positive signal to the market once we get through kind of currently where we are, that that change is also got a commercially viable model behind it.
And I just wanted to add on the data piece, the reality is in the US, when a real estate company hires its first sustainability person, the first 1 to 3 people do no climate action whatsoever. they're just doing data and reporting and auditing of the data and everything. And it's sad, right? Like we have so prized, the reason that the data is good is because for a variety of reasons, we have prized data coverage and quality over actually the data showing that you did anything. And so we need to figure out, in order to scale this, like really how to balance that and saying like, we can't, just because you have this beautiful report, when the report shows that your EUI has increased every year and your emissions have increased every year, you don't get an award for that. And so we really need a change in attitude in order to be able to scale a lot of it. We're teaching to the test, and the test is data quality, and it is gotten in the way of action, frankly.
I totally agree. How long has this industry been using data as an excuse not to make a decision, right? Even before sustainability and decarbonization came along. And I get impatient with organizations that say that, because you said it before, you have to learn by doing. That is the only way to tackle this, to learn by doing. No one's done this. Point me to an organization that's operating, a big organization, at zero carbon, right? So you have to experiment. And so you're absolutely right. There's a data sort of overload, and particularly in Europe, I think people are getting fatigued with it, if I'm honest. So because it has to bring insight at the end of the day. So I totally agree. I think, look, enough of that. Let's get on with stuff.
Yeah, but I don't see it going away. CSRD hasn't even started, nor has the California. So we're in a tough spot as sustainability professionals. I mean, we're also pulling in our comptrollers now and having conversations around data accuracy. So data is only going to be much more, continue to be a focus, and it's a challenge for us and for everyone in terms of data accuracy and getting the data and getting it right.
But it will bring investment. That regulation will bring investment from organizations. I have to report into our board and to our shareholders. Yes. The risk officers are getting involved. The CFO's getting involved.
Yep.
They're getting a budget, and it's going into the finance department, not into the sustainability department. So I'd say, it won't just be sustainability people doing this. It will be compliance and risk officers doing it. So I agree, it's a problem, but it's a problem that triggers a response from corporates.
Right, and that's what my point is, that this is only going to grow, and it's maybe a necessary. We're in the middle of that pain point, and we'll just have to we'll get through it. But we're just right in the middle of the storm.
Yeah, the data, there has to be accountability for what the data is saying. And right now, we're not quite there. So we're totally right. We're not going to get rid of, we're not going to be like, oh, we did it, we're done with data. Like, no, this is going to continue, but there needs to be accountability on climate action from that data. And I think the investors have been hesitant to do it. I think they're getting there, where it says, I don't just want I don't want perfect data. I want your data to show that you've done something about it. They've been, because it's scary for them, right? So if I say, okay, I have a building that reduced by 2%, like, was that good? Like, yeah, if you never touched that building, 2% is lame. You should have gone to 20%. But if you've been, doing, it's a LEED Platinum building, and you've been doing retrofits every year, 2% might be really great. And be able to differentiate between those two things is more or less impossible, which is where we've gotten into this like transparency only. But I think we're getting sophisticated enough that we're going to be able to say, you should have done more, or great job.
I think part of the issue too is we're pulling in colleagues from other functions who they don't understand the data. And so right now they're getting them the data is one thing, but I completely agree with you. We give them the data, and then it's like, okay, so now they don't understand it. Yeah. And that's part of the education that needs to happen.
Yeah, I just want to do a shout out to the Climate Registry, of course, our hosts. Here, the backdrop, I was just behind you, credible carbon reporting, of course. And I like the way that you said in the middle of the storm here, because I think all three of you have said this in different ways. This is a transition from data just because to data to actually drive decision making at all levels. You mentioned at C-suite levels, at the building level, empowering the frontline building managers and others. There is a real purpose moving forward. I think that there's a real, again, there's something in here. I think there's a sprinkling of, I don't know, fairy dust or something into this, into the reporting process, because it is actually starting to empower decision making. Look, I'm going to do another pivot back to a previous point of the conversations, which is how you work in your industry sectors. You talked before about partnerships, how important that is, and I think I'd just like to hear from you about how you doing how you do that actually, because you talked about talking with your competitors about market signaling and which I recall, and other points that you're making, particularly around the lessons learned that can be disseminated across the US in a way that helps empower all of those that are going through the climate transition. I was thinking particularly of our local leaders that we had in the launch event yesterday, and thinking where they are in the states where they're operating. But just a conversation around actually how you do that right now and what you would like to do moving forward.
Sure. So we engage again through industry associations, like I said, in terms of ASHRAE and the Montreal Protocol, Kigali. Like we're actively engaged in there. But to one area where I think is a new territory for us, it goes to what you've been talking about, embodied carbon. So when Carrier this week announced its net zero plan, and when you look at our entire value chain, about 5% of our carbon footprint sits within the materials that we purchase. So a lot of it is for us, our products in use, but there is that 5%. And we need to get to net zero. And how do you do that? So there's an opportunity for us as manufacturers to send the right signals to our collective supply chain about embodied carbon is important to us. We want to see things like green steel and so forth. And how do we go on that journey together and send the right market signals collectively to our supply chain to enable that transition?
I'm right now in the process of sort of trying to aggregate a demand signal to spur federal funding towards decarbonization. So if anybody listening buys concrete and would like to say that they would buy a lot of it at market rate if it were low carbon, that would be very helpful. Feel free to reach out. And the other thing we're doing is we're trying to teach everybody how to use the Scope 3 protocol. So I'll be going through a series of workshops in the winter and spring. I'm saying, okay, guys, let's all figure out what our inventories are. Here's how we did it. You can do it your own way if you want to, but also like a whole lot of research went into the way we're doing it. We want consultants to use this and sell it to clients. Like, let's get going. So we think that that's going to be great. And the other thing is, in America, it's a really collaborative industry. And I work for Australians who are all also very collaborative. So for example, my first renewable procurement, like it wasn't like I had to do this alone, right? Like I was able to call, my friends at the data center REITs, who were the real estate investment trusts, who were the first to do these deals, and they explain everything. No, explain it again because I'm feeling slow this morning. And like we're having that, and I've done that for so many other people. So it's a wonderful dialogue. Nobody's keeping anything close to the chest, and they haven't for years. That's our real estate culture. So ideas actually spread quite quickly, especially thanks to USGBC and convenings that they do.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, I actually think there could be more collaboration. I think it's what you say is great, but this industry hasn't always been best at collaborating with things at scale. And part of it is because it involves compromise. I really think we've got to accept that when you collaborate, actually you are trying to fit into one system, not your own system. I love the Scope 3 thing, so that's great. It's great about this. You get real learning, so I'm going to take that away. And as a consultant, I would definitely be promoting that, because Scope 3, like if we think Scopes 1 and 2 are hard and carbon is hard, you ain't seen nothing yet. Scope 3 is really difficult. And I'm amazed actually how many investors out there don't include tenants' emissions at the moment. So, and we just need to get over that hump, because that's kind of not right. So, so I think there is room for a lot more collaboration, actually. We're just starting on that. And I'm really interested to look at other industries.
Oh, yeah.
To see how they've collaborated and created these kind of tipping points where the whole market ends up moving. And it's interesting. You don't need that many players to be able to do it. And particularly in an industry like ours, where there's loads of FOMO going on and everyone wants to sort of join the leaders' crowd. I think we need to create those tipping points. So there's some really interesting examples from other industries where that's happened.
I think aviation is a fantastic example that we need to be looking towards in terms of the way that aviation companies have come together, created standards through which they are able to invest in sustainable aviation fuel. There's more like UN protocols around fuels and stuff that have made it sort of, and when those get influence. We don't really have that for the construction materials, but they have been able to come together, competitors, and agree on how they trade futures of SAF. And that has enabled a lot of investment and much more rapid progress. It would be very hard for us to do that in real estate, but I think that's the kind of collaboration and advanced market signaling that would be game changing.
I just want to, it's great you raise aviation because I think aviation's about 3% of global footprint or something like that, isn't it?
I was in aviation, so yeah.
Yeah, and I heard whilst I was here that data centers are getting close to 2%, right? So isn't that interesting? Like that one asset class within the real estate industry is getting, as close to aviation, which gets a lot of headlines and a lot of press. And we probably haven't got enough data centers at the moment as well. So that could be a really interesting area to collaborate on.
And the data centers are who pioneered all of the energy work that real estate does because they had to, because they use so much. So it's been, we learn everything from the data center companies. Gotta love those data centers because one building would use more than an entire office portfolio.
Super interesting. And I just throw in the maritime industry too. The marine decarb space is really advancing very quickly. And again, this is sort of out of necessity, actually thinking about green shipping corridors.
Yep.
That you can't do this unless you're actually collaborating globally. So that's a combination of signals from the shippers who again are looking at their scope 3 emissions, like all the way down the value chain, and then actually being able to connect up, just thinking if you are going to change the technology of ships, how do you do that? How do you refuel them? And what does that mean for local equity once you're decarbonizing port energy systems? And there's actually very many knock-on effects. So I really like that idea of looking at tipping points for change. Look, I can see Dan getting anxious to ask a question, so I'm going to throw to you, Dan.
Thank you. Yeah, so I have a question about scalability. So that's the topic of this. And in the U.S., massive building stock that needs to be addressed with retrofits and growing markets. How contingent upon Inflation Reduction Act funding or that federal support with tax credits and these incentives is the ability to scale? We're in an exciting moment right now, and it's allowing a lot of retrofits to happen in programs that we're waiting on funding to pencil out. So we're there. How do we keep that going?
I'll kick it off. I like those types of regulation and incentive, but if we're going to rely on them, then I think we've got a problem. I want market forces to do the work, and I think it's going to be really interesting when the transactional market returns properly to particularly investment, and when the debt markets, which are starting to turn as well, really respond to some of the decarbonisation challenges in terms of risk out there. So I think if the lending markets and the transaction markets actually build this in, and we're definitely seeing that in Europe. Definitely, right? We've seen our first multifamily portfolio that couldn't get any European debt because it didn't have a credible transition pathway and CapEx plan. So if the transaction markets and the debt markets start to build this in as a risk and an opportunity factor, we will see that a degradation of value really take place and the uplift and creation of value really take place. So this bifurcation will get really real on balance sheets. And I want that to be the driver rather than regulation, but we might need a bit of both.
It's been really hard for the private sector to unlock IRA monies for retrofits. And I find myself having these very surreal conversations with members of Congress who call and they're like, why aren't you guys using the money? And there's a bunch of reasons for that. Our tax folks have basically indicated that if at anywhere below $10 million, the juice is not worth the squeeze in terms of the amount of work that it would take to get the monies versus what you're doing. And very few building retrofits have that number of zeros attached to them. We have a number of zeros disconnect a lot. So there is that. Also, currently, like unlike say loan program office where they're able to pay on invoice, once you get through that program, currently for that part of the IRA, you're not getting your funding until the product is put into service, which is many years after you spent the money. And so it's hard to have that be part of the investment criteria because you don't know if it's going to materialize. The other thing is it's performance-based, which is what real estate hates because we don't, what if it doesn't perform? So it has to be a 25% reduction. Well, what if I got to 24.4%? You're just not going to pay me at the end of all of this. And so to me, if there's anybody from the federal government listening to this, what we need, and there's no demonstration projects, like we desperately need a press release and a party of somebody who's like, I did it, I unlocked the funds, here's how I did it. Nobody's gone first. I hope in the next 6 months somebody is able to like pop the champagne. That will go a really long way. I think there's a little bit too much waiting and hoping that someone will take the plunge. And this is like first mover's disadvantage. Nobody wants to go first. And so I think there needs to be more proactive, like, hey, you seem like you have a great project. Let's make this work for you and in partnership because it's not that I don't think it'll happen. It will happen. I'm really excited about it. I got a project that's going to apply. But it's going much slower than anticipated because of these barriers.
Yeah, and I think that's where we have to continue to engage with our policymakers and explain the implications of what they put on paper and what that means in reality. And I think that's something that I'm sure we're all doing. I know we're doing, having that dialogue with policymakers. And it's important to come to events like COP to have the voice of industry to show the practicality of what it means when for the issues within the regs that unfortunately are there. But we're helping to shine a light so that we can get on the other side.
And I'll just say, to get really into the weeds, there's also transferability issues. So, for example, we have a large military portfolio, but the 45L provision within the IRA that would be what would fund those retrofits, I can't transfer that tax benefit, and the holding companies that have those military installations have no tax appetite. Now, I could set up a shell company to then exist and one of our competitors have done it, but like, good God, why is it this hard? Why is it so hard? Why can't I transfer the tax benefits? Like that's how solar always works, is you always can transfer the tax benefits, especially for real estate investment trusts that don't have a tax appetite. So also who can get the money has been made, I think, more difficult than maybe needed to. I'm sure there are good reasons. But
Alex, last question.
Pressure. First of all, Sarah, I'm absolutely stealing your baseball card idea because it's amazing.
God, I'll send it. It's like you can like Google it as well, and it's there.
I'm in. And just to pick up on one of Guy's threads, I'm just wondering if any of you have any thoughts on how we get to a place where leading and not historical indicators are being used to assess the value of commercial buildings.
I think a price of carbon, right? I mean, that seems to be the answer for when you look at evaluating projects. It's typically a price of carbon.
Yeah, and I think some organizations may do it themselves. And we know some investors that are already doing that by putting into their modeling, their asset management plans, a carbon price. They're making the business cases work. So it can be self-enforcing. It doesn't have to be kind of market forcing. So you have to have the courage of the leadership and also the sort of capital behind it to back that up. But changing the actual valuation system could be too much of an ask. So I think there is organizational leadership to kind of set the tone on this. I think the transaction markets could actually fulfill this role, though, and I think they will do it first in Europe. So watch with interest probably a year from now, if we're sitting down. Don't know where we'll be sitting, but if we're sitting down, have the transactional markets actually proved that there are many more illiquid assets out there, that actually real estate has turned back into quite an illiquid asset class, which it always was, like 30 years ago. And that is going to send some real messages out.
And I just say it's great to set carbon targets, and everybody should, but it's also good to set really hard physical targets. So we've said we will just not use gas, period, in 2040, which means that when we do a property acquisition, we have to figure out how we are going to rip all the gas out of that. So, that's which is very unpretty right now. And so that's the sort of hard targets in addition to the emissions targets also, I think, shift you to leading indicator thinking.
All right. We're at time, I'm afraid. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you, Corey. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Guy. Thank you, Peter, Liz, USGBC. And thank you for the Climate Registry
Thank you, Climate
for
Registry.
hosting us. Thank you.
Thank you.